Welcome everybody to this installment of the Food Talks series from the University of Oregon. I'm Stephen Wooten. I'm the director of the Food Studies program and a faculty member in the Department of Global Studies. Super happy to be here hosting this channel and having our guest speaker. I'm going to introduce in a minute. I want to first thank Lisa Fink for her help in putting together the series this year. Super helpful getting all of these presentations done, communicating about them, connecting people. You know, we're persevering, all of us, through the COVID times to keep connected. And I really am heartened by how many people have been participating and showing up to the talks that we do. I think people are, yearning for connection and yearning for companionship and yearning to share food with each other. We'll do that at some point soon, I hope. Just grateful to Lisa for helping to keep it all going. And today we have our presentation from Dr. Emily Contois. I'm going to introduce her. One of the things I love about Emily's work and her presence is that it's just so full. One of the things I love about looking at her production and the things that she does, it's like just a kind of a really rich and varied kind of offering that she presents. She has a PhD and an MA in American Studies from Brown University and an MLA in gastronomy from BU. And she also is an MPH from UC Berkeley. That's a pretty full set of tools, right? To be looking at the things that she's interested in: food, identity, gender, and kind of like popular culture and media. I'm going to put in the chat the link to her site, which, if people haven't visited her site, it's fabulous in terms of what you can learn about Emily and her interests and the way that she communicates. It's not surprising that she's in a media studies kind of niche. She's very, very good about telling stories, right? Telling stories in academic kind of settings as well as news settings. If you do just a quick Google of the book that she's going to be talking a little bit about today, Diners, Dudes, and Diets, you'll see that she's been interviewed by so many different kinds of news outlets and bloggers and stuff. She was on today with the British Library earlier, talking to folks through a portal in London. So I'm just really grateful that she agreed to share her work with us and come to the University of Oregon virtually. And like some of you have already mentioned, I really hope that we'll be able to have her here sometime in the future in person. Also, thanks to the co-sponsor of the talk today, Women's and Gender and Sexuality Studies. It's one of the best parts about food studies for me is all of these different connections. You know, this year we've had probably 6 or 7 different co-sponsors for talks that we have. And I think that's really an exciting edge for us as academics or people interested in issues around food. So we always get a little flavoring of something that we might not be seated right at the spot for, get a little something different, which I think is great. So I'm super grateful for that co-sponsorship. Let's see. I'm not going to do very much more in terms of introduction, but I am going to put your website in the chat so people can go and check that out. And I think in terms of format, we are recording the presentation because there are a bunch of people who are really interested in hearing what you had to say, and we'll share that. And just a heads up for people that are on here that the recording is going, and we're going to do a presentation part, which I think probably about 20-25 minutes or something, and then we're going to have a Q&A, open discussion. And I realize that people have meetings that they got to get to at certain times, so we'll be mindful of the time as we approach 1 o'clock West Coast time, and let you know that we're coming up to the end. Try to get a few questions in before we finish up at 1. Is there anything else, Lisa, that you think we should do before?
No, I'll be sharing some more information in the chat, so just take a look at that. There are already links in the chat to
Great.
Emily's website and a link to her book information, and then I'll provide some info about the food studies program there.
Perfect. That's a good point because, we want to keep the table or the door open to the table for people who are not locally connected to the U of O Food Studies program to bring more people into it. So we'll put that information in too. So without further ado, I turn the screen over to Dr. Contois, and thank you very much for coming to present to us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Stephen, for the invitation, for the lovely introduction, to Lisa for all of her help, and to all of you for coming as we have embarked upon so much Zoom time. I'm so privileged, so happy that you would want to spend just a few more minutes with me. So I do have a presentation for you because I have lots of images to share with you, some of which I've spent, the better part of a decade, pulling my hair out about. So really excited to get to dive into some of those with you as I give you the broad strokes of this book, and then we can go wherever you would like to in the Q&A. And so I was so thankful for Stephen to say it made sense that I landed in media. Maybe it made more sense. I've been very fortunate to land in a media studies department that thinks food studies is media studies, is part of media studies, that food is a medium that connects us, that is a part of how our humanity is sort of constructed, how it is historicized, in this really vibrant way of connecting everything, right? From people to plants, soils, different cultures. So thankful that this is where I am and to be here with you to chat a bit about this book. And so I'll start with the dude, right? Perhaps the most attention drawing, right, word in this title for an academic book. So some of you might be thinking immediately of the Big Lebowski, right? Of like, who the heck is the dude? And so he's certainly a figure that circulates in popular culture. He's someone who you might recognize, not just from this film, but from others that were popular in the 90s and the early 2000s. And so with the dude, I'm looking at this fact that social definitions of masculinity require that what we think a real man is, right? That he works, competes, triumphs, and provides. But the dude abides, right? This phrase turned mantra that we get from this film. And so in the book, part of what I'm doing is theorizing dude masculinity as a particular gender discourse at a particular moment. So the dude is cool. He is unserious and ironic in the way that he celebrates the slacker, the average or the even below average guy. And so the dude resists some of these conventions and demands of sort of a normative masculinity, like competitiveness or breadwinning, an aggressive sort of mindset. He is not aspiring to six-pack abs, right? We can talk about the dude's body as well. Instead, he relaxes. He opts out of that striving and opts out of any attending struggle. And so despite that slacking that makes it easier for some men to move through the world, the dude remains complicit in what Connell coined for us, right, as hegemonic masculinity, this dominant form of masculinity in a particular place at a particular time that thus orients all other masculinities around it, as well as subordinating, right, femininities and sexualities. We can think about that dynamic there too. So the dude overall, right, is holding up this structure of power and inequality, even as he celebrates a different way of being a man. And so the dude is applicable to multiple identities. There are female dudes, there are Black dudes, Asian dudes, there are just less of them, particularly when you look at the kind of media text that I'm drawing from in this book. And so the dude primarily connotes a sense of masculinity that also has an inherent whiteness to it. When we think about how he is about upholding and maintaining these existing sort of structures of power. We see that across race, sexuality, gender, ideas about youthfulness and able-bodiedness as well. And so there is also a contemporary historical context to the dude that I'm looking at in this book. That although the dude was never a dominant gender discourse, it's not like there was a moment in 2006 where all of a sudden every man you knew was suddenly a dude. That's not how this worked. And I trace in the introduction of the book the much longer history of the dude, right? From the dude as this sort of fashionable dandy, to the dudes of dude ranches, to the dudes of the surfer druggy counterculture identity. But the dude that I'm looking at in the book is one that reemerges with the social upheaval of the new millennium, where a confluence of economic, social, cultural, and political factors all collide that destabilize white masculinity and its sort of status within society. So we see things changing in gender roles, right? Of more married women, right, becoming breadwinners in their family, more married women increasing their educational attainment. This is at 2000 is the year that axes cross, women, right, getting more education than the men in their lives. 2000 is also when we have George W. Bush, right? Perhaps the dude president, right, who is elected in part because of his beer test pass, that he's who voters most wanted to get to know and have a beer with, and then exercises a new sort of form of cowboy diplomacy when we think about 9/11, when we think about the Homeland Security Act, when we think about different ideas about immigration, about border control. This is all happening in this moment. And then as we look to our next presidential administration with Barack Obama and this hope, right, for a post-racial America, that these conversations about race in America, right, also collide with these conversations about gender. And then this was also an administration, right, with big changes when it came to sexuality in the military, within the confines of a legally recognized marriage. And again, the dream executive action as we think about pathways to citizenship, who counts as a citizen in the United States. So all these things, right, are in sort of the cultural, historical, economic mix. And so I just said economic because the big thing missing on this slide, right, is the Great Recession. And so economists, right, give us this very narrow time frame for the Great Recession. But when I write in the book about the Great Recession era, I'm talking about a much longer cultural time period under which the economic conditions of the Great Recession shaped culture. And so unlike the recession that we recently went through and are recovering from, that has significantly affected women and women's employment, this Great Recession, right, was called by cultural critics and economists alike the he session, right, a man session, as we looked at the types of jobs and their gender demographics that were being lost. And so this was a moment where breadwinning, right, the ability to hold a job, to support a family, to have a successful career, right, is destabilized because of actual economic conditions, which causes this gender negotiation for men of masculinity, whether it's to lose a job or to be underemployed, to be unemployed at home, and perhaps making a different way through domestic space. So you might be sitting there like, okay, I came to a food studies talk. Like, why are we talking about the recession? So how do we have this connection between the dude and food? And so what I'm looking at in this book is how the food, media, and marketing industries manipulated the dude, right? This particular way of being a man in order to sell what were perceived to be feminized food and figures to men. And so I'm looking at this time period from roughly 2000 to 2020. And I argue that they start by building their strategies upon the wholly masculine precedents set by a specific food genre of dude food. And so dude food as a cultural, thing that exists, right? This is Google Ngram Viewer to see dude food's mentions in books. His historical specificity is exactly the same, right, as this rise of the dude discourse that I'm looking at in the 21st century. As we look at this destabilization of a white straight masculinity during the recession, dude food is one of these cultural phenomena that emerge, right, as a space to reclaim and draw those boundaries back around, right? An idea of a white masculinity sort of holding on to its prowess and authority. And so I did not know what the cover of my book would be, but it was quite perfect that they gave me a burger, right? This signifier in so many ways of masculinity. And interestingly enough, every time someone has published a piece about it, right, this is the image, right, over and over again, the basic cheeseburger or inside hook, right, like these crazy exaggerated sort of burgers. And if we see a body or a person with the burger, right, it is a white man. And interestingly, right, we get to see a man eating, right? When we think about how men and women are sort of represented in stock photography, right? A man gets to dig in, right? Put his mouth all the way around this big burger. And so dude food, right, is this category that I was so interested in putting forth a definition that talked about gender, that thought about class, and thought about it all through this culinary lens. So I brought for you a perhaps archetypal dude food burger. This is not your average, right, cheeseburger that you would go out and get after you've had a hard week, right, and you just need a burger. look at the name, right? The name on the menu is the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, right? This is a burger that is literally coming for you, right? It has multiple patties. It has onion rings, gigantic fried ones inside. And we don't have buns. We have grilled cheese sandwiches, right? This is a playful, sort of pushing forward of like what counts as a burger, right? Playing with that grammar in a way that is exaggerated and has an irony and a playfulness to it. But it's also pushing us in interesting directions when we think about gender, when we think about waste, when we think about ideas of moderation, right? Dude food pushes back against all of that. So just in case you need more examples, I have brought them for you. So as we think about, hot wings, right? The spicier, the more dudish, right? So spicy that it might actually cause pain instead of pleasure, right? Or an interesting balance of them both. Things like nacho fries, right? Where we're successful not only at Taco Bell, but across bar menus. Guy Fieri's trash can nachos are one of my favorites in thinking about what it means, right? To have nachos so desperately dressed and laden with their toppings, but also one that is presented tableside from a can, pulled upward and the chips vomited out at the table, of how it's pushing back against all these expectations of, what fine dining is about, how we conduct ourselves in restaurant spaces, that this is playfully and purposefully, right, bringing in the trash, bringing in a different set of taste. Dude, Where's My Car is one of these dude films that we could talk about. And so Dude, Where's My Hot Dog in Las Vegas plays on that, interplay between pop culture and food to give us a hot dog so dressed in toppings we barely know it's a dog. And then of course, dude food, is bacon everything. So I brought you bacon weave, instead of a taco shell with a line of macaroni and cheese and then all of the taco fixings inside. Meatballs stuffed with cheese wrapped with bacon. So you see this layering of excess, this layering of meat, all this fatty deliciousness sort of across a lot of these dishes. And so as we think about what dude food really is, of course we see meat repeated over and over again, not just as an ingredient, but also in this symbolic way. Of course, drawing from Carol J. Adams' foundational work as we think about how meat, masculinity, right, construct one another in a way that also links the subordination of women and animals. And so this idea of meat being not just an ingredient, but a part of these power dynamics. So I ended up defining dude food as comfort food, but with an edge of competitive destruction, right? So we saw that in the flavor profile. We saw that in the portion sizes, right? We saw it in the exaggeration of ingredient upon ingredient when perhaps one would do. So this idea of a full throttle flavor, right? All the way down, just rushing in, massive portion sizes, that also collide with these ideas of sort of value menu quantity and these class-based ideas of unpretension, right? That it's simple food, plated simply in an unfussy way. And then the spaces in which dude food is served, right? Also sort of play on those class politics of how we eat. And then I'm interested in this idea of like nutritional risk-taking, of pushing back against moderation in some ways, right? That the dude still aligns with these hegemonic conventional ideals of healthy food being sissy stuff, right? This idea that dude food still repeats some of those conventions, but the excess, right, is enthusiastic and ironic and playful. So it plays in this ambivalent way of what it is and what it's about. And so dude food embodies, right, this irony and this playfulness of the dude, as well as its edge of privilege, right, this confidence and fearless freedom that is that privilege of the dude to do and be whatever he wants, right, without investing in a way to make that sort of slacking and giving up, right, sort of privilege to all. And so eating and living like a dude comes with a set of anxieties, risks, and consequences. And so you'll see, food media write-ups, right, 7 dude foods that are actually healthy. You'll see things like the heart attack grill, right? Like they're purposefully giving themselves a name that pushes, right, at this idea of health, of risk, in the sort of playful conventions of who they are. But as we have real food system conversations, right, about waste, about how our systems ought to function, dude food as a logic, right, of eating applied over a food system, applied over a population, right, only contributes to these inequities as we think about what it actually does as a way of eating and a way of moving through the world. So a number of brands deployed the dude in their food advertising. I love this one for Velveeta Shells and Cheese. Their campaign was called Eat Like That Guy You Know, right? So this is, for example, right, the guy who put a skylight in his bedroom last year and it's looking pretty good, right? Or the guy who works the kiosk at the mall selling remote control helicopters, right? He literally gets paid to play. These are the slacker heroes that we are holding up. And don't worry, Velveeta only has to be microwaved. It's not really cooking, it's still masculine. KFC also leaned into dude food with this sort of funny tongue-in-cheek survey, likening sort of dude food practices to eating food off the floor or double dipping, right? This idea of pushing back against sort of good manners. Oscar Mayer's portable protein packs are basically Lunchables for adults that are also aligned with this protein obsession, right? That continues, will not fade away, of how Americans love having more protein than we need. And then Kraft Heinz, right, shifts from their Weight Watchers line of really low calorie frozen food for women to create this brand Devour, intended to be, right, frozen comfort food for men, which they launch with, quite misogynistic commercials. One was called Lunch Spank, where we see a man dressed as if he's working in an auto body shop. He's microwaved his meal, he's taken it out, and he's holding it in his hand, but he's talking dirty to his meal as if he would to a lover. And then he spanks it at the end with his fork. So it's this really like strange, trying to be funny dude humor that has this irony, this winking, this playfulness, but that is still a part of, right, a patriarchal culture where actual inequities exist when it comes to gender and sexuality. So these were some examples where we see the dude deployed. But what I'm interested in this book is one step more complicated in what marketing scholars call gender contamination. This is consumer resistance to brand gender bending. So this can work in two directions, right? Gender contamination can be empowering, right? To be a woman who conceives or consumes a brand intended for a male audience. But it can be disempowering, right? Perceived as disempowering for men to adopt a brand that is perceived as feminine. So in the book, I look at examples like Coke Zero, right? How do you sell diet soda to men? You give them an undiet diet soda, and you put it in a black can, and you market it with, dudish forward commercials. One of their first campaigns was called "It's Not Your Fault," and so it was all these funny ads with Benjamin Engerman's voice from Archer and Bob's Burgers, right? Like this voice that people would be familiar with. Saying, it's not your fault, that you're watching basketball on television instead of doing your chores. It's not your fault that you're not doing your homework, right? Like you're a guy. It's not your fault. This is just what you do. So we see this like dudish forgiveness of slacking literally baked in, right, to the messaging of how do you sell Coke Zero to men. Similarly, yogurts was another food that I looked at. How do we go from a grocery store aisle, right, that was pastel and white, and with things like Activia talking about digestive health, or Light and Fit, right, that's purple and pink and about the pursuit of a body that's not just fit and ripped, but light, right, a body that barely exists, right, in the sort of feminine messaging. So this is where we see things like Powerful Yogurt, right, try and make a big splash, proudly proclaiming themselves the first Greek yogurt for men, in a container much larger, made of a heavier plastic even, so that the materiality of the plastic even is meant to connote this idea of masculine strength. The sign of the bull, the black coloring, these, sort of sans serif fonts, and then of course, the six-pack abs literally chiseled into the side of every container, which you can sort of see on the side of this one. So thinking about in the marketing, in the product ideation, in the packaging design, right, we saw these huge attempts to thwart and combat this gender contamination. And so I'm not interested in that as a marketing scholar, right? I'm interested in it because it shows us, right, how power is organized and controlled in society, particularly one like ours, which is patriarchal and where power consolidates around masculinity, whiteness, and affluence. And so as we see the way these products were marketed to thwart gender contamination, we see those structures of power so easily at the surface. So the story that I tell in Diners, Dudes, and Diets is how these industries manipulated the dude to thwart this sense of gender contamination in order to be able to sell what were perceived to be these feminized food and figures. So in one of the chapters, right, I look at these cookbooks that are purposefully developed and sold to men. This is where we see things like men with tool belts filled with kitchen tools, right? Like having to lean on these other masculine conventions to convince men that it's okay to cook at home. Of course, we see lots of meat, we see simple instructions. So looking at the various ways, right? These 21st century cookbooks had to go about convincing men that it was okay to cook if they didn't care about it too much. Then how did Food Network go about earning more male viewers to primetime programming? And so we see a figure like Guy Fieri, right, rise to fill that void, right, who is in this lineage with Emeril Lagasse, right? He's definitely picking up something that was already generating on the network. And so I'm interested in him as this dude chef figure who is pushing back against the sort of expectations of a chef, of a quote unquote real man in some ways, particularly in how he presents himself, his clothes, his hair, and this idea of who we think a celebrity chef, a food media figure should look and feel like. And in recent, like he continues to fascinate me. I end that chapter with like the rise, fall, and rise of Guy Fieri, of how after Pete Wells gives him a 0-star poor review in the New York Times, the first and only, right, the column had ever given a, horrible review that would have destroyed anyone else's career. But Guy has been recuperated, right, as this good dude who embarks upon charitable endeavors and who has a significant fan culture around him that I find so fascinating, that so many of us, right, have fallen into that trap of not wanting to be critical of the apolitical nature of the dude, right? He always remains sort of disengaged and at a distance. And so we see that in a really interesting way with Guy Fieri. Then I look at the food products that we talked about just a moment ago, everything from how new artificial sweeteners were created that tasted more like sugar, built upon these stereotypical assumptions that men demand real, satisfying flavors. And then, of course, looking at the packaging design and the messaging that we see all throughout the campaigns that supported them. And then ending with weight loss. This was where my work started in my undergraduate work, studying diet culture, masculinities, and commercial weight loss programs is what I worked with when I was at BU writing my thesis in gastronomy. And so that ends, this final chapter building upon all the conventions laid out in the previous ones of how particularly Weight Watchers, but also Nutrisystem and Jenny Craig went after men. Right? How did they seek to increase the numbers from the 10% they'd sort of always had to something a bit greater? And when you think about the dude food I spoke about in the beginning, that's one of their strategies, right? They're promising men that that is what you will eat on a diet. You are just going to track, right, what you eat and the weight is going to fall off, that there's no expectation of a sort of feminized sense of dietary discipline, that the male body, right, still moves through these spaces in a sort of powerful, immutable way. But that immutability also reveals sort of these limits of patriarchy for men. While the promise of transformation to women is a capitalist one, right? If you believe that a better woman, a better mom, a better self lies within you, if you can lose weight and then move forward as her, that's of course a destructive promise that these industries have made. But for men, there was no promise at all. There was no acknowledgement of the self, of any sort of emotional experience with one's body. And so it provides a really powerful example of looking at these programs side by side, how they constructed gender in order to sell themselves to men and women. And then in the conclusion, sort of a where are they now? I track each brand of the changes that happened in society after 2016, right? We have a resurgence of overt and obvious toxic masculinity throughout our culture, right? Incidences of hate crime that were significant compared, right, to sort of the 10 years prior. And so in that moment, the dude, right, sort of falls out of fashion in a way as an advertising strategy. Some of these brands sort of take gender out of their pitch, which is interesting. Some of them extend the dude to everyone, right? Which with differing effects depending upon how they went about it. And so if you're sitting there wondering, why does this matter? Part of this work, right, is sort of a cultural studies intervention to say that brands and food media can reflect, repeat, and reinforce definitions of identity that are conventional or even regressive. This book documents a frustrating number, right, of very conventional and very regressive examples of what gender is and how it's attached to food. So I brought you one of these side-by-side screenshots of how Weight Watchers marketed to women, offering, tools to help you shop, to help you buy healthy foods, recipes to be able to help you make point-conscious food at home, right in your kitchen. Well, the man is never in a grocery store. He uses like the barcode scanner on his phone to buy a bag of chips while he's out on the run in a convenience store. And we only see him, right, outdoors with the grill, this masculinized space for men making food. And he gets to make his favorite food anyway, right? A porterhouse steak. There is no discourse of sort of change or expectation. And so brands, right? And I hope for some of our gender studies audience here, right? I really thought about sort of Judith Butler and this idea of gender being this open category, right? That it can be re-signified. And so brands and our food media space more broadly can be a part of this process of cultural resignification, of opening up possibilities, instead of continuing this very conventional and even regressive application of a strict gender binary across all these elements in our food media lives. So I don't think that White Claw can save the world, but I do think it's an interesting example of a purposefully post-gender approach in how they marketed hard seltzer, and did so in a way that it was not only popular across numerous disparate demographics, but even becomes a cultural phenomenon. So thinking about how post-gender, gender neutral, but at least not gender stereotypical ways, right, of marketing these products in the future. And then, of course, to acknowledge that representation matters. It matters deeply. But brands and these companies, right, food media companies, have to move past that. That what we want is this true equal access to production, to the seats at the table, these positions of power and decision-making with equal pay. That we're in an interesting moment of reckoning in our food media landscape, right, of actual changes of who can make those decisions and change the way we have these conversations with gender, with race, with class, with sexuality. And so these discourses, like the dude in food media and advertising, they matter and they have real effects as we think about how they construct the realities in which we live. And so the dude shows how and why food in particular, and then food media as a part of our mediascape, remain such fraught spaces for shaping and reflecting identities. The threat, the perceived threat of gender contamination was so much more powerful with food, in part because we eat it. Right? Food comes into us and becomes part of us, ourselves in our sense of identity, ourselves in our sort of physiological, biological existence. And so this concern about gender, particularly a fragile masculinity, right? Food gave me such an almost easy way in, right? There was too much evidence to draw from for these sorts of patterns. And so these dude food stories reveal for us how power flows through media and our broader consumer culture. And I hope that that reveal is useful so that we can track and reconfigure it, so that we can all be a part of a food media future that has more justice and more joy for all of us. So I'm so happy to take your questions, your comments, to have a conversation together. I leave you with a few more of these infuriating images that I have spent time looking at, and can't wait to hear your thoughts.
Bravo, that was amazing. Really, really great presentation, touching so many different threads with such aplomb. Great. I look forward to the questions and comments that people have. Lisa and I can try to help if you want to use your raise your hand button. That's great. And we can try to help feed people your way.
Sounds good. And if you're more comfortable in the chat, that's okay too.
Yep, the chat's fine too.
Yes,
Yep.
this is how I've been teaching for the last year and forever.
I know, right? Fabulous.
I have a question. Hi. Can I go?
Yep.
Yes, please.
I don't have all my fancy microphones plugged in, so can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're fine.
Okay. Thank you. That was a really sort of fascinating talk. I'm a psychologist who studies men's eating behaviors here on campus. And so I think about a lot of the issues that you mentioned a lot. And I would love just sort of your professional and personal opinion about something that is related, but I think a little distinct, which is actually like intervening on a more individual level with men's eating habits that are maybe more closely related to body image and disordered eating. So one of the things we're constantly running up against in this area is men don't like to, say they feel out of control of their eating. It goes very much against masculine norms for eating habits. And as a field, I think because of these gender norms, we don't have good data on what are men's experiences with distressing eating habits. We know they exist. We know they have body image concerns at probably not quite the same rates as women, but very common. And we're just sort of starting to think about, how do we actually engage men in a way that gets solid data and is effective and helpful?
Oh, I appreciate this question so much, because it is another one of these examples, right, of how patriarchy hurts all of us, right, including men, that it doesn't make for these safe, comfortable spaces to be able to talk about our bodies and talk about eating. And so one of the things that I did in the chapter on weight loss was I followed a number of men weight loss influencers. So some of them had been a part of the Weight Watchers community when they were trying to sort of bring in more men, and then some of them had sort of broken off once that relationship didn't work. And so these men were asking for, right, the social support that Weight Watchers provided. They were asking for a visible, welcoming space to be within these programs and to have, men dieting, right? Like, I don't want anybody to be on diets, right? Like, diet culture hurts us. But at the same time, right, when we think about that access of power, that for men to be able to have that experience with their bodies is really important. So one of the theoretical interventions in the book is talking about what I call the weight loss closet, right? This idea that for men to talk about weight loss, to talk about their bodies, to talk about anxiety about their bodies, difficulty eating, experiences overeating, that they're put into this closet, right? That has to stay silent and has to sort of stay controlled and play by all these rules of conventional masculinity. And so these programs, right? These companies, they played a role in constructing that weight loss closet, right? Even as they were trying to gain customers, they were still reinforcing all those gendered conventions about how men are supposed to, right, experience their bodies and experience food. And so everything that I've seen, I think normative discontent is different than actual rates, right, of eating disorders or disordered eating. But the research showing, like normative discontent, right, for anybody who doesn't know, right, comes out in the 80s, women psychologists to describe women's experiences in their bodies, right, that to live in a culture that holds up the thin ideal, it is normative. It is an everyday accepted part of being a woman to hate your body and think it's not good enough. And so we have the evidence, not just with college men, but men all throughout their lives, that they feel normative discontent too, right? That their bodies don't match up to the ideals that they're also fed from media images like films, like Muscle and Fitness magazine. And so I think creating those safe spaces that are maybe all male to be able to have those conversations about how you actually feel in your body. That the men that I was following and got to, do brief interviews with as a part of the book, like they had podcasts, they had lots of, okay, so that was one other interesting thing that Jason told me, right, is that he wanted to create this space for men, but the majority of his followers and listeners are still women. These are women who want to help the men in their lives. And so it's a big stumbling block to still figure out. I never read anything that was like, we've figured this out. It seems like the only big moment that makes it easier is like later in life, if a man's had a heart attack or some big change in his life, that opens a door through the lens of sort of health and longevity to be able to have these conversations in more open ways. I think particularly for young men, right? This idea that you're not supposed to worry about any of this and to kind of engage in risky behavior as a part of being a man, that these norms are absolutely part of what's in the way. So I don't know if any of that is helpful, but just to affirm, like, what you're seeing is absolutely real, and we need good and better solutions to be able to have these conversations and these interventions when they're needed.
I think Amanda has her hand up, and then we have a comment and a question in the chat that we can come back to after Amanda.
Yeah, thanks so much for speaking today. I also loved your recent appearance on Gastropod, my favorite podcast.
I love them too.
So great. I'm an assistant professor of media studies here, and I watch far too much Food Network. So one of the I see big gender divides in food and cooking is the idea that domestic home cooking is feminine and feminized, and professional cooking and baking are still very much masculine spaces. Can you talk a little bit about how that played into some of the campaigns and the analysis you did?
Absolutely. So I think one of the things that's actually quite interesting about Guy Fieri is how he straddles that line. Because even though he presents himself as this dude chef that's like out of bounds and breaking rules, saying, I'm not suit and tie and I'm never gonna be, right? He's quite self-actualized and like, this is who I am. But fatherhood was always this like dominant discourse of how he always brought in the domestic and how he talked about cooking to feed his family, cooking with his sons, even the charitable cooking that he's done recently, he often brings his sons with him. So that discourse of fatherhood into this public realm of the food media celebrity was one way that he sort of brings that out. I think another place though is looking at the cookbooks that were written for sort of everyday men to cook at home. That one of the ways that editors, right, worked to make this seem appropriately masculine was to include recipes only from sort of professional chefs, right, to lean on that perceived credentialing of the professional food world, that it's okay, right, for men to cook at home as well. And so I'm certainly building on the same literatures, right, of the idea of cook versus chef, domestic versus this public realm, that inequity and that perceived binary, right, is one of the ones that's so interrelated to this public feminine production consumption divide that I'm looking at. And so I was, doing this thing with the British Library with a Michelin-starred chef who wanted to say, right, that the food world now is like inclusive and equitable, and like his kitchen is full of people from all over, right? And we just have this global, wonderful village. And so I had to bring up the statistics, right, of like in the United States, at least, right, to pretend I don't know what's happening in the UK too, right, that we have equitable graduation from culinary school and 80% of head chefs are still men. So the different opportunities that are made available to female chefs, whether it's to get a loan to start the restaurant, how they're covered in food media, right? Or is the food review herald them as a genius and an empire builder or a nurturer, right? Bringing her family recipes and, working with her team. The way media has covered, right, men and women chefs has been so different too. So absolutely, right? That's a part of the foundation of the book too. And let's see, Erin. Yeah, so I definitely talk, right, about this idea of playfulness and this question that I could anticipate in the text, right, of like, oh, you're just a humorless feminist, right? Like these are jokes. You're just missing the joke. So I acknowledge, right, some of the intention of the playfulness, but argue in many sections in the book, right, that we can't make this argument that it's just a joke when it doesn't exist in a vacuum, right, when it still exists within a patriarchal culture in which women have inequitable experiences in every facet of our lives, including, ways where, sexual assault and violence as we think about how women move through the world. So an example that I can give you of that, Dr. Pepper 10 is the other sort of diet soda that I looked at. And so you've probably seen their commercials and their cans, right? It's not for women. It's gray, gunmetal gray, and has like studs on it. But one of their digital things that they do when they launch is they create this online space on Facebook that you had to be a man to be able to enter, right? This idea that like women couldn't even be part of it. And then there were, for example, a like shooting range where you were shooting at feminine symbols, right? Like lipstick and pot holders and there was a list of manly thou shalt nots, right? That you won't take selfies, and that you don't say oh my god, you don't take pictures of your pets, right? Like all of these things that have a degree of humor, sure, right? But like they're lame jokes, and that they don't function, right, in a world where the joke can land when we think about how those inequities still exist. Powerful Yogurt did the same thing. I just did a piece in Jezebel, right, about the death of Brogurt Think. Jesus. But the ads that they used when they launched were so over the top that the editor was like, are you sure these are real? And I was like, yeah, like this is real. Like the Vidal, group created these aren't parodies. The idea that, a woman in Daisy Dukes, right, her truck breaks down and she gets out and this man like rips open his shirt and he can use his abs to jumpstart the car, to make the buttons pop off of her shirt, that this is how we sell yogurt to men, right? Like, sure, it might have been, created with this idea of like a wink and humor for men, but it exists within a world, right, where women are still objectified and treated in these violent ways. So I completely agree with you, Erin, that there is this ambivalence around this idea of humor and then the actual sort of environment and power structures in which these food genres and these particular ads take place. I appreciate the point.
I think Diana is next with her hand up there.
Wow. So first, thank you for such a smart and interesting talk. This is just a pleasure to listen to. I had a question about where we are in the cycle of institutionalization of dude food. So I'm thinking of stoner cuisine, like Frito pies and things like that, and how many of these dishes start as, a homemade thing that a college sophomore is making in their dorm, and then cycle up to something that's in Boston has a stoner cuisine restaurant, where you can get a very expensive version of a Frito pie, and then it cycles onwards. Do you see new types of dude food that are emerging in a homemade context?
Ooh, what will the next dude food be? I don't have a good answer for you there, but I think what I saw during the pandemic was things like dude food sort of leaving that restaurant scenario and becoming, right, something that could be delivered to your door. So, the work that I'm doing right now in the Super Bowl and sort of this intersection of like food media and sports media, that like 2020 apparently was this time when like for the 2021 Super Bowl, we were going to run out of chicken wings because people had continued buying them, right? You couldn't go to the bar, you couldn't be with your friends. But given the nature of a chicken wing, right, it's pretty easy to prepare and then to be able to do delivery pretty easily. And so Guy Fieri as well with these trash can nachos, right, which had this table side sort of production element to it, was also something, right, that you could order and have delivered to your door. So seeing this idea of it leaving the restaurant and then becoming a part of this ghost kitchen concept, becoming a part of this sort of appification of the food world, right, as we think about how restaurants in this country are going to survive, revive, come back once COVID is hopefully over soon. But I think this is a good point, right, of how some of these foods, right, align with like fair food, right, of like everything being fried and exaggerated and over the top, and how that circulates, into these different spaces and then takes on different meanings. One other tiny point, just like a paragraph in the book, of thinking about like the American gastropub, right, not the pub in the UK or gastropubs throughout Europe, but the American gastropub is sort of like the dude of fine dining, right? That it gets to sort of, undo its tie and, relax, very different in the decor, the style of the menu, maybe the cost, but you're still going to see sort of like excellently executed dude food, right? And so then all of a sudden we see these dishes sort of take on a different meaning. So I hope those examples fuel some of the excitement behind your question, which I think is a good one. Like, what will come next, right? Like, who saw nacho fries coming, right? Like, we have to talk to the trendologist people. I feel like I'm always sort of better equipped to be like, well, let me tell you what happened 100 years ago that, makes sense. I don't tell the future well. I'm not good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Diana. And maybe we'll do Daniela, and then I'll go to Kira's question or comment.
Hi there. Hi from Liverpool. So
Hi.
Hi there. I'm a lecturer in marketing, and I was particularly fascinated by your post-gender brand, which is a very, very interesting concept and quite novel to me. So I was wondering if you had more examples rather than the soda that you, was it a seltzer that you presented before? And also, if you could clarify a thing. So where do you trace the line between hegemonic masculinity and dude food? Because in another context, I loved your presentation, if I had seen a yogurt with the ball and the six pack on the side and all of that, I would have labeled like under the hegemonic masculinity world. I mean, I understand that a product category like yogurt is probably the feminine side of it, or is feminized, but where do you trace the line? Or like the bacon nacho thing, like how can we tell is dude food a non-hyper masculine hegemonic food?
Yeah. So the dude still subscribes. No, I think this is one of the good tricky points, right? That the dude still subscribes to and is privileged by and complicit in some of these aspects of hegemonic masculinity. So part of what I argued with the sort of design and packaging, particularly of the yogurts and the diet sodas, is they build this foundation, right, upon masculine conventions that they can then use these advertising campaigns and images and messages that are much more sort of dude focused. And so some elements of this dude, right, they still just present themselves as if hegemonic masculinity is the main thread. And when I first started this research, with just the dieting when I was a master's student, that's all I thought I was sawing. Like that's what I was seeing, right? That this was just hegemonic masculinity. There had been other scholars of gender and food where like that's the lens that they were using. But as I kept looking, right, at these examples and at the historical, like this is a historically constrained time period when all of these products come out, that there was a different masculinity, that gender scholars are using hybrid masculinity, right? That it is a manifestation of hegemonic masculinity that's a little bit different, right? That resists some aspects of it, that presents itself slightly differently. And so the dude is one of these hybrids. So you're absolutely right that tons of what we see, right, still falls into that hegemonically masculine conventional kind of category. And then sometimes, depending upon the product or the campaign, there's this stronger kind of dude edge. And to your point about like post-gender, gender neutral, I feel kind of ambivalent about like, should that be, what we're moving towards? Because, I've been so grateful for opportunities to present my research to marketers and to like have that back and forth. And so that part of the book really benefited from me getting to do that with one particular group in London, actually, where they were like, no, like we still need gender, like taking gender out of the equation isn't what we need to do. And so a non-food example that they gave was the Gillette ad that came out after that toxic masculinity one, right, which created, so many waves with conservative folks. But the one that comes after is a young Black trans man learning how to shave from his father. And it's really endearing, right? And so they were saying, if we don't still acknowledge and tell stories about gender related to our products, like we're missing opportunities like that, right? To show moments like that matter. And so that really resonated with me, that I think what I'm asking for isn't for gender to not exist, right? Like my mother is still so surprised that I just came out a girly girl, right? Like that's who I was, right? Like I'm not asking for a world where we all aren't who we are and how we move through the world. But I do want a food media space where we are not actively impinging and creating these constraining binary categories, right? I'm asking for us to be more flexible, more inclusive, more imaginative, more realistic, more joyful in how we represent how food is a part of our gender identities. And so I think this transgender moment we're in is an important one that sort of pushes these industries forward, right? That like a gender binary never existed. That was never the reality. But for so long, that was the only language that we were using. So I don't have good examples yet because people haven't figured out how to do this well yet. But I also think that post-gender, gender neutral isn't the only strategy of how to move forward. I think I talk in the conclusion about how the UK has actually banned, these stereotypical ads. Like every ad in my book would have been banned, in the UK under those new stipulations. So I think that's, regulations would never happen in the United States, but the UK case will be really interesting. Like how does that change things?
Thank you.
Did you see the question in the chat there from Kira? I don't know if you can see that.
have. Okay, I feel like I've observed maybe the opposite of the dude effect in food diet trends for women in the past decade or so. Yes, this rise of wellness. So in the book I read about wellness as diet culture's supposedly harmless cousin, that it's not, right? Like we're seeing these discourses repackaged in a really seductive way, but seeing so much of the underlying framework sort of stay there. So this wellness movement, goop culture, focus on purity and clean eating that feels very rooted, yes, in white femininity. And I'm curious to if I've seen and looked into this. Yes. So one of the things that couldn't fit in the book was, I'm not sure, I'm sure someone can find the link and drop it if you haven't. There was this visual essay in the Hairpin early in the 2000s, maybe it's 2011, of women laughing alone with salad, right? All of these, you know, infuriating stock images of women eating what one of my students called sad salads, right? This is just like water-filled negative calorie eating, right? These are salads that have no nutrition, no sort of gumption to them. And so I situated that within sort of this diet culture moment that I first studied, you know, first started studying when I was in college, which was still like Snackwell's cookies and, you know, light and fit yogurt that was meant to be nothing and was so sweet and so artificial. And so seeing this shift to wellness, one of the concepts that I write about in the book is zero, right? This is non-diet diet culture for men. That instead of being about lack, it is about value and being filled up, right? That instead of being about sort of restraint, it's about, right? Sort of this opposite. And so wellness in some interesting ways has applied zero to everyone, right? To men and women sort of in this wellness space. So the comparison that I drew was from these sad salads and negative calorie eating, right? And the obsession with salad, you know, celery, right? Which like any of us millennials can maybe remember from like teenage years, right? Like celery, which go back much farther than that in 20th century diet culture. But two, right, power bowls becoming the healthy item across so many fast casual restaurants, right? That once we put a quote unquote ancient high protein grain, superfood ingredients, right? Adding beans, adding chicken, making it this really high protein, fulfilling, sustaining, gigantic salad, right? That's how salads were always created and marketed to men within the pages of Men's Fitness, for example. So we've seen that kind of like a manly salad become the power bowl of the wellness moment. So I've definitely done a little bit of work thinking about how those changes are happening. I don't think that gets us fully outside of a lot of these problematic dynamics that are so much easier to see within diet culture. But that is some of these more positive elements, right? Like I'm much happier with the salads that are presented as sort of healthy and for women now, right? Than when we look at sort of the media pages 20 years ago. But I appreciate the question very much.
Probably have time for one more question, and this has been you've been very generous with the timing. Done a great job with your presentation and so many great questions. Let's see if there's anybody else who has something they want to offer.
The pressure, the final word, yes.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe Harper would like to ask a question.
Thanks. This has been fascinating. As one of the few dudes here this afternoon, I don't know those people, the dudes that you're referring to. They don't exist in my world because I'm a farmer more and a cook, and I don't know anyone that eats that stuff. And my question is, you know, when they do the marketing campaigns, they run it through focus groups and they see what's going to get them more money, right? So is the dude and this mythical dude that I don't know, the product of this bombardment of this mythology? Or are there a whole bunch of dudes out there saying, we want more of that stuff? You know what I mean? It's kind of chicken or egg kind of thing.
No, exactly. So I think there's two important things with the dude. One, that it was a gender discourse that exists within an actual cultural historical moment, right? This Great Recession era was one in which the dude does emerge, but he is manipulated, reinforced, and exaggerated, right, by these industries for that sense of profit. But I also like the other point that you've brought up of this idea of gender contamination, I think, might also be a construction of the advertising industry, the same way that they love to come up with demographic categories like millennial and Gen Z to understand how to market to us better. That as I presented this work at conferences and other venues, people would go like, my husband totally eats yogurt. Like, this is my boyfriend. He drinks Diet Coke. Like, of course there were men, right, who were eating these foods and didn't feel like it impinged upon their masculinity. So I'm so interested in how these industries have played a role, right, in putting out these definitions of what's masculine and what's feminine, and how we're supposed to be men and women and sort of identities within and beyond those categories. So it is this really interesting interplay between the commercial marketplace and an actual sort of cultural construction and like our everyday individual sort of experiences with food. So your reaction totally makes sense, right? When we think about it within sort of this world of marketing, there's this one level of abstraction of thinking about how this mediascape works. So I consider you lucky and wonderful that there are no dudes in your life and that these are not products you want to eat. I think that's a great way to do it.
A terrific presentation and a great set of questions and answers that really kind of expanded the lens remarkably. Really great. Super happy and grateful for you taking your time to do this presentation with us, do it through this Zoom lens, and all the work that you're doing. I encourage, folks that aren't familiar with your work to follow you in various places and see what you're up to next, and keep in touch with your kind of communications in all their different forms about food and identity and gender, and also pedagogy is another thing I didn't mention at the beginning, is something I really respect about your work. You do this scholarly work, you do the research contributions, you talk to the press about your work, and you're really fascinating stuff, do really fascinating and impressive stuff with your students. So I think that's really cool too. Thank you very much. Yeah, and I think Lisa put in our next talk, which is in, I think, 2 weeks' time. And we invite you back if you're a newcomer to the U of O Food Studies kind of space. Come back and see us for that next talk, and look forward to meeting some of you in person before too long. And thank you very much for your presentation today.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks to all of you for coming. It's really, really great. Thank you.
Awesome. We'll catch up soon. Bravo. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.